to the thing that everybody is here for, I would like to introduce our speaker. Edward Struzik is a writer and educator from Edmonton, Alberta, and a fellow at the Institute for Energy and Environmental Policy at Queen's University in Kingston, and has been called one of Canada's preeminent modern-day explorers by Canadian Geographic. His travels by foot, ski, dog team, canoe, kayak, icebreaker, and helicopter have taken him to some of the most remote corners of the world. He has been writing about diverse scientific and environmental issues for more than 30 years and is the author of 8 books and the recipient of more than 30 awards for his writing. These books include Northwest Passage, Arctic Icons, The Big Thaw, Travels in the Melting North, and most recently, Dark Days at Noon, The Future of Fire, about wildfires and our management of them. He is a regular contributor to the Yale Environment 360, an international online magazine published by the Yale School of the Environment, and his many articles appear in journals and magazines such as Scientific American, Policy Options, Canadian Geographic, and in newspapers such as the Los Angeles Times, Globe and Mail, and the Toronto Star. His photographs have appeared in exhibitions curated by the Smithsonian in Washington, D.C., and the Canadian Museum of Nature in Ottawa. Hundreds have graced the pages of magazines and books. Our talk tonight will be on the subject of his last but one book, Swamplands, Tundra Beavers, Quaking Bogs, and the Improbable World of Peat. Edward is currently a member of the New York Times Bog Squad, a group of scientists, researchers, and experts who answer readers' questions about the role that peat accumulating wetlands play in biodiversity. With the help of his beautiful photos, Edward will explain why these wetlands are as globally significant as rainforests and function as critical carbon sinks for addressing our climate crisis. Please give a warm welcome to Edward Struzik.
Here, how about that?
Perfect.
Okay, let me just tell you how I got started writing this book. I really didn't have much of an idea about peatlands until I went up to the high Arctic and canoed a river called the Thompson on Banks Island, and you can see it there at the very top in the red. That's Olivec National Park, and I canoed this river, as you can see, the Thompson River, before it became a national park in 1992. And because it had never been done before, we really didn't know what to expect. And when we landed, it was really just a kind of a desert environment at the very beginning, and a lot of snow falling, a lot of wind blowing. And it was kind of what I expected, or we expected. And then as we started heading downstream, things started to green up a little bit. The weather didn't change very much. We got, intermittent snow and some freezing rain along the way. And then it just kind of got greener and greener and greener. And I was really, I'd traveled to the Arctic many, many times before this and had been on many Arctic islands, but I'd never seen anything quite like this. And you realize, as we started looking at the mosses and the lichens and the vascular plants, it was really a lush, verdant valley. There have been so far counted 97 mosses, 83 lichen, and untold numbers of vascular plants. On the northwest coast, you have these vast peatlands here that just spread out for miles and miles and miles. And along the way, we saw these guys, muskox. There are 80,000 of them on the island the year that we canoed that river. They were just everywhere. We saw them every single day, and it was just fascinating to watch them. There are also 7,000 Peary caribou. Peary caribou they're a quintessential Canadian animal. They're only found on the Canadian Arctic islands, and they're the smallest of all caribou. They're really, really tiny. The antlers make them look really big. And that year was a year for Arctic fox. They seem to be almost as plentiful as the muskox and the caribou. We saw Arctic wolves. This one came into our camp one night and peed on the side of my tent, as if to say, this is my territory. Please leave. Arctic hare, lemmings. It was a big lemming year, and so there was a lot of hawks. A lot of raptors were nesting on the island. Rough-legged hawks. When we checked, their nests were just full of chicks. Peregrine falcons. I love the peregrine falcon because they don't build a nest, as you probably know. They just lay their egg on the side of a cliff on a rock and then basically just tell the chick, well, here you go, kid. If you're going to make it in this world, you're going to have to get through this. And I was just amazed, that the wind at that time was blowing about 80 kilometers an hour. And it was remarkable that they didn't get blown off. I'm sure they probably do. We saw a lot of ground nesting longspurs. There's sandhill cranes just everywhere, Pacific loons, snowy owls, and hundreds of thousands of snow geese. I think there was a population of about 400,000 snow geese nesting on the island. And then we saw this remarkable sight. There was a grizzly bear den. And at that time, grizzly bears were not common, in fact, almost unheard of to be on the Arctic islands. And of course, now because of climate change, they're moving northward and they're denning on the Arctic islands and they're fighting with polar bears, killing them in some cases, and mating with them in other cases. So the eureka moment, came on a solo trip that I'd made quite a bit later on the Mackenzie River. And I'm sorry, what I have here is actually not exactly what I was hoping to present you. Because of the mix-up, and I transferred an older file here. But let me tell you, I was 66 solo trip down the Mackenzie River and passed through 86 different wetlands, including this one, which has 1% of North America's loons nesting on them. And the thing about this that really got me was that Mackenzie River is really, really muddy, and it was having a terrible time trying to find a place to get some nice, clean, fresh water. My water purifier conked out on me, and I literally was I was almost hallucinogenic. It was so hot, and I was so thirsty that I didn't know whether I was going to make it. And at this one point, I saw this glimmer coming down from the hilltop right around here, and I saw this beautiful clear stream trickling down. And then when I parked my kayak, I went up and looked, and had that smell of Scotch whiskey, that peaty smell. And it was just wonderful water. And I just drank heartily, and I thought this is where I was going to camp. And I got my stove out and started cooking, and I had one last carton of Kraft cheese dinner left, which was a childhood favorite. And I was going to eat that, and then I heard the ravens starting to caw, and I realized when you see them starting to fly overhead, you know that something not good has happened. And what was happening was that there was a grizzly bear coming down to look at me, and I ended up just filling my water bottles and having to dump the Kraft cheese dinner into the water and move downstream. And of course, later learned that this was one of the biggest one of the rampart wetlands are some of the biggest in North America, and they've just been set aside by the indigenous people who live in that part of the world. So what are peatlands? Peatlands are bogs, fens, swamps, and marshes that accumulate peat in waterlogged, oxygen-starved conditions. And peat is partially decayed vegetation that builds up over centuries. And swamping that came with deglaciation, that's from the last ice age 12,500 years ago, was a major driver of peat formation. And mosses such as sphagnum are the foundation of peat. Some mosses can hold up to 25% of their weight in moisture and survive drought and extremely cold temperatures. And my friend biologist Catherine Lafarge grew a moss that was buried under a glacier in the high Arctic for 400 years. She grew it back in her lab. So that's how hardy they are. They are, for want of a better term, serial killers. They snuff out vascular plants by taking up positively charged ions, such as calcium and ammonium, while releasing hydrogen ions. As long as there's sufficient water, mosses will grow upward and outward, shooting out capsules that contain hundreds of thousands of spores. They really are the gunslingers of the peatland. Nothing that can shoot them down except reindeer lichen, fungi and algae in one symbiotic relationship. That's really the only thing that can put a check on these guys, along with the lack of water. And peatlands, as I discovered, are found on every single continent, almost as far north as you can go in the high Arctic. This is northern Ellesmere Island, which is much, much farther than Banks Island, and as far south as Antarctica. We've got peatlands in the Alakai Swamp on the Hawaiian island of Kauai, the Mojave Desert, the coastal marshes such as Cape Cod and Kujabujuak of New Brunswick, the Great Dismal Swamp in Virginia and the North Carolina, and we've got peatlands 20,000 feet high at the base of the Sayama volcano in Bolivia. The Zogi Marsh in the eastern part of the Tibetan Plateau is one of the biggest peatlands in that part of the world. Indonesia, Africa, and parts of the Amazon have peat, and as everybody knows, so does Great Britain. Northern Europe has got a lot of peat, and Russia contains the largest peatland areas in the world. And of course, the slides that you're missing here is I had pictures of, peatlands in your backyard, Burns Bog, the Fairy Bog on Bowen Island, which was named by a little girl who thought that this was the perfect place for fairies to be. And you have the Meteor Bog, which the Nature Conservancy just bought and set aside around Prince George. Not a lot of peatlands in British Columbia, but some of them, like Burns Bogs, are pretty spectacular. The Inuit harvested peat to build or insulate houses. Indigenous women gathered mosses for diapers and sanitary napkins. It was really of great value to them. The Vikings and the U.S. Navies used bog water on long voyages because when sphagnum dies, it releases these polysaccharides, which block bacterial growth, and this helps keep fresh water. So the U.S. Navy routinely used to go to the Great Dismal Swamp to load up on water from those peatlands. The preservation value of peat is why centuries-old bodies have been unearthed nearly perfectly preserved in these bogs. It's also why we know this place on northern Ellesmere Island in the high Arctic, which looks like this now, looked like this 4.5 million years ago. It's an ancient peatland that I helped unearth several years ago. It was started by Dick Harrington from the Canadian Museum of Nature and continued on by others who'd followed him. And this is what it looked like about 4 to 4.5 million years ago. Peat was once and still used as a source of fuel. 5% of Finland's energy comes from peat. That's the equivalent of 1.5 million tons of oil every year and 14% of the country's greenhouse gas emissions. It also explains why the Netherlands was a superpower in the 17th century. The Dutch figured out a way to harvest peat, cut it in blocks, and sell it to the Germans and use it to create energy. And it was really why they were a superpower. They had the most powerful navy in the 17th century. And bogs and fens were also seen as the haunts of will-o-wisps, jack-o'-lanterns, and moss people. Mora Kikamora is a favorite of mine because my mother told me about it. She grew up and lived around a peatland in Poland. And when she was brewing beer, fog rose up over the bog. And that's when you had to go home because if she followed you, she could find her way through the keyhole. And as my mother would say, you don't want to know what would happen once she got into the house. The Jersey Devil was a legendary swamp creature in the U.S., made famous by an NHL hockey team, the New Jersey Devils, and Bruce Springsteen's song "A Night with the Jersey Devil." So peatlands suffered a bad rap. They were as evil as Fenians were perceived to be in Britain. Both needed to be illustrated, as the Illustrated London News suggested in 1869. American settlers brought this ethos and these superstitions to the New World. William Byrd of Virginia, who became the governor, claimed that the air above the Great Dismal Swamp on the Virginia-North Carolina border was so noxious that migrating birds flying over would fall from the sky. And he proposed, and this is quite serious, draining it and turning it into farmland. And George Washington was the head of the first company that tried to drain the Great Dismal Swamp. That happened before he became president of the United States. And his company used enslaved people to dig drainage canals and to cut down trees. And those who tried to escape were hunted down by dogs. And for those who escaped capture, the swamp was a shortcut to freedom. Many hid in the deepest, darkest parts of the swamp before finding their way to Canada. And others stayed. Recent archaeological evidence suggests that there were three generations of enslaved people who lived in the backwaters of the Great Dismal Swamp. And reports by some of them was because really it was just darn good water and there was a lot of wildlife and it was really a good place to be. But unfortunately, leading agriculturalists at the time, such as Henry Flagg French, saw peatland as the miasma of unhealthy soils, the poison of unwholesome water. And Flagg invented the French drain, which is still used today to basically drain water away from houses and on farmlands. And then the Swamp Acts, he was persuaded Congress to pass Swamp Acts of 1849, 50, and 60 that led to the drainage of 65 million acres of peatlands in the United States. And by the 19th centuries, most of the Atlantic white cedars were gone, and all that really remained now are just a few stands in the Great Dismal Swamp. The Great Black Swamp, Michigan, Ohio, and Indiana, along the shores of Great Erie, was almost completely drained. In southern Ontario, bogs like Wainfleet and Sifton suffered the same fate. Uh, in British Columbia, Burns Bog, they were extracting peat, I think in the 1930s, and it lasted for about 50 years, and essentially reduced the size of that bog by half. And a lot of that peat went to Nevada for the creation of bombs during World War II. It produces it. There are some extracts from it that could produce magnesium. Toronto infilled and dredged peatlands like the Humber Marsh since the time of European settlement, and newspapers and the public celebrated. Cities all over North America drained them for public health reasons because they felt, like the Europeans did, that diseases such as cholera would rise up from these places and that it was best to drain them. In 1906, the Canadian Department of Mines became interested in the possibility of using peat found in Alford Bog west of Ottawa as a source of fuel for locomotives and home heating. And so they created their own company to do this, and it lasted for quite a while. And the peat that burned in those locomotives burned so badly that it sent sparks all along the railroad route and started all kinds of fires. In fact, at the turn of the century and right up to around 1920, the railroads were the principal starters of fire in Canada. In the 1950s, the oil and gas industry declared war on peatlands and they used to have this magazine, Imperial Oil Magazine, and described to their readers how they're winning the war against muskeg. And they had the support of the National Research Council that got everybody together in 1964, basically with this edict. Canadians must learn how to build engineering structures on muskegs, how to drain it, and perhaps how to travel over it. And unfortunately, too many Canadians have tried. A low point, I think, came in the 1970s from when scientists at the University of Ottawa came up with a plan to dump waste oil from drilling operations in the Arctic on Ellsworth Island's peatlands. The reason why? Because plant and animal productivity there was low and it was really worthless. So we've done a pretty good job of destroying the peatlands on the Earth landscape. Basically, they just represent just 3 to 4% of the Earth landscapes now. But the good news is that they store twice as much carbon as the world's forest. In the Hudson Bay James Lowell lands, which are the largest peatlands in Canada, store 5 times more carbon than the equivalent area in the Amazon rainforest, which is remarkable when you think about it. And the lowlands really it's one of my favorite places outside of Banks Island. I've been there several times. I wrote a book on the polar bears in this region. There are about 800 polar bears living there in the summer and fall when the ice on Hudson Bay melts and they have nowhere to go. And it's the only place in the world where female polar bears wander about 80 kilometers inland to den in the peat, in the lowlands. And no one knows why they do this, but they do. And I was involved in a survey of these dens in in the 2000s. And this was in springtime when we expected most of them were leaving their dens and taking their cubs to the west coast of Hudson Bay. And we found them all over the place, heavily concentrated in what is now Wapask National Park. One of my great ambitions in life was to get inside a polar bear den. And so I convinced both the helicopter pilot and the biologists in this case to land in this minus 30, 35-degree weather. We first flew around, make sure that there was no activity of polar bears there, and then landed. And then I got my wish, crawled in, looked around, then got out back into the helicopter. And just as we were taking off, the helicopter pilot starts poking me and pointing in the distance. And I don't know what he was pointing at until I looked at my pictures later, and I'm not sure that you can see it, but if you look at the top, the tree is right in the center, you'll see the rump of a polar bear sticking out. That bear was there all the time, probably just looking at me, wondering, what the hell is that stupid guy doing? I'm just glad that she didn't come in for a closer look. It's also extraordinary because this is the only place in North America where you get both migratory tundra caribou and woodland caribou, and they depend heavily on the lichen that grows in these peatlands. And of course, wolves prey on caribou and those polar bear cubs. Fox feed on what's left behind. And the Hudson Bay lowlands are quite possibly the most important bird nesting area in North America. You have 300 plus species of birds, 1 to 3 million birds fly north to breed in the boreal, and this is a huge part of the boreal. Some of the world's highest abundance of the peat-loving palm warbler, and very likely a high proportion of the global population of the mysterious yellow rail, a small chicken-like marsh bird that is rarely seen and little studied. I don't know if anybody has seen one, but it's one that I've been trying to find for the past 40 years. The best way of trying to find them is because you never see them. They don't fly when you come by. They scoot off like mouse. In fact, I think someone called it the mouse bird. But if you clack two rocks together, they'll clack back. And I'm told that that's the best way of finding them, but I've had no luck so far. And of course, the peatlands have, wonderful array of plants such as orchids, this lady slipper, which is one of my favorites, the carnivorous sundew. And this is remarkable because when I was in the Alakai Swamp in Hawaii, this photo is actually taken in the Alakai Swamp. And I was trying to figure, what is a boreal sundew doing in a tropical peatland? And the explanation came from the botanist that I was with at the time, who told me that there are these, I'm trying to remember, the curlews from Alaska fly and nest in Hawaii. And they expect that some of these sundews attach themselves, a kind of a 1 in a million situation, and essentially is adapted to a tropical climate. And so if you go to the Alakai Swamp, which I highly recommend, but I would take spiked boots and make sure that it hasn't rained because it's quite a jaunt. It's really an amazing place. Cloudberries, blueberries, and cranberries, of course, all grow in peatlands. That's where our cranberries are found. And you get untold numbers of moths and butterflies. Many of the largest rivers in Canada drain the lowlands of the Hudson Bay area, like the Harricana, the Albany, the Seal River. And did I mention mosquitoes? If you're going to have peatlands, you're going to have a lot of mosquitoes. So you've got to be prepared, except if you're in the Alakai Swamp, which is really remarkable because the mosquitoes were absent from the island and only arrived about 150 years ago with all the shipping activity, and they haven't quite made it yet to the Alakai Swamp. So you're in this swamp-like environment, but there are no mosquitoes. Peatlands filter water more efficiently than our forests do. And the degradation of peatlands in southern Ontario is why Great Lakes are being choked up by so much algae. A healthy peatland can stop or slow a wildfire, And we know this. We discovered this in 2016 when the Horse River fire in Fort McMurray forced the evacuation of 88,000 people. And the firefighters at the time were surprised by the fact that they expected that there was this peatland, wetland ecosystem in between the fire and Fort McMurray that would slow the fire down. What they didn't realize was that the forestry department had drained that peatland and never told them. And so what you had was just a new stand of black, highly flammable black spruce. And once the fire hit that, it just raced into town. And we know peatlands, because they absorb 25% of their moisture, can mitigate flooding, like the one that flooded Calgary in 2003. One of the reasons why Calgary flooded so badly because it has drained 90% of the peatlands along the Bow River and within the city. So there's no sponge, basically natural sponge to soak it up. And Sherry Westbrook from the University of Calgary demonstrated that had we drained the wetlands up in the mountains where the beavers created these beautiful wetlands, had we drained them, the flooding downstream would have been much, much worse. And I think that everybody knows with what happened in Abbotsford a number of years ago with that atmospheric river rainfall. One of the reasons why it floods so badly is that it used to be a former peatland and lake that got drained. And basically, water follows gravity, and it needed someplace to go. And there was just not enough pumps to be able to stop it from flooding that area. So, what's the future of peatlands in a warming world? One scientist I know suspects or expects that 300 to 500 kilometers of the southern boreal forest, where we have a number, where quite a few peatlands, will be gone by the end of the century because of climate change. And tundra peatlands will be transformed by things like this. So when frozen peatlands thaw, and in the Arctic, there's 800 feet of frozen peat thick. And when it starts to thaw, the landscape slumps. And this slumping you see here, this would be the size of 3 times the size of your hockey arena in Vancouver. And it slumped just before we got there. And we also saw further downstream slumping where it basically drained an entire river into another lake. And we're seeing this all across the Arctic now. And when wildfires come into play, as we're now seeing on the tundra in the Arctic, it's going to get worse. Hillsides like this one in Alaska just collapse because the peat is like, that frozen peat is like cement. But when it warms up, it just basically disintegrates. And so entire hillsides fall apart. And the northern boreal forest will also be transformed because patches of melted permafrost essentially disintegrate, water bubbles up, and I don't know if you've ever heard the term drunken forest, but these are forests in the Arctic where all the trees are leaning up against each other. And the reason why they're leaning up against each other is because these black spruce have adapted to that frozen peat. And when the peat thaws out, they just fall over because the roots have got nothing to hold on to. And so that's the word for it. They're drunken forest. And the drunken forest is over time because drowned forest, because all that moisture keeps percolating up. And it doesn't help when we build mines on peatlands like this one on the Yukon Northwest Territories border that has now been abandoned, and the Canadian taxpayer is paying to try to prevent it from collapsing. Or strip meters thick layers of peat to mine bitumen in the oil sands of Alberta. Seismic exploration conducted for Alberta's oil and gas industry has disturbed at least 1,900 square kilometers of peatland and increased methane emissions by 4,400 to 5,100 metric tons per year. 18 companies now hold over 13,000 active claims in the Hudson Bay lowlands. And Premier Doug Ford is adamant that this is going to be developed. In fact, he said that he would get on the bulldozer to build the first road going in there. So what's in store for the future? There's still so much more about peat that we do not know about, and this is just a wonderful, wonderful thing. In 2017, Alana Smolras, who I know, discovered that the Massasauga rattlesnakes in Georgian Bay, the most northern colony of rattlesnakes in Canada, they survive the cold winters by denning themselves in the insulation of peat. And so they've adapted in this marvelous way. The Ami borer was thought to be extinct. It's a moth until one was found in a fen in 2009. People were looking elsewhere for them because no one really wants to go into a mosquito-infested fen or bog, and dozens more have been found since then. In 2017, the world's largest tropical peatland was discovered in the Congo. And David Cooper, an American scientist, and his colleagues have discovered thousands of mountain fens in the Canadian Rockies and the Southern Rockies, all the way down to South America. And this one I really like because I saw this firsthand myself. As now beavers are now waddling onto the tundra from the boreal forest and building dams on tundra peatlands, which is kind of cute and kind of correct because we used to have giant beavers that lived in the Arctic, beavers that were 8 foot long. So now, in a way, they're returning. But the problem is that when they dam and create lakes on this permafrost, they're accelerating the thawing that's taking place. The good news is, unlike sea ice, glaciers, and ice caps, we can restore peatlands. And this is happening. Canadian scientists are leading the way. They are in demand internationally to help restore peatlands. And it's really quite simple. I've seen it done. It's all you really need is some seeds and some water. So you flood an area that used to be a peatland, you throw some seeds on it. It's much easier than growing a tree. And the Chinese have brought them over to try to restore the Zogi peatlands. And as you can see, they're doing it is now healthy again and supplying really fresh water for millions of people and also livestock. European countries are doing it now, and Russia was rewetting its peatlands with the help of Germany before they invaded Ukraine. And the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service is restoring the Great Dismal Swamp. And I might add, if you ever go down to the Great Dismal Swamp, and I highly recommend it because most Americans still, at least from that part of the world, still avoid it because they think either it's haunted or that it's just the worst place to be. And in fact, one botanist from the University of Virginia told me that when he was a graduate student, they never went on a field trip to the Great Dismal Swamp because they didn't think anything was there. There's a tremendous amount to see there, but the bugs are unlike anything you've seen. The U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service has a video that basically tells you is that bug dope is not going to be enough to protect you from these buggers. So you've really got to come prepared and perhaps at the right time of year. Alaska, Minnesota, and Canada are still in pretty good shape because we still have a lot of pristine peatlands. So really, I think we've got time. It is a good news story. We can plant trees. I'm all for that. But I think our money would be better spent on restoring our peatlands and protecting those peatlands that we still have remaining.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Edward. That was really just amazing to hear so much information about what how important these bogs are and all the different ways that they're have been threatened down through the years. I want to remind people to put their questions in the chat. And before I go with the one question that's in the chat, I just wondered, could you quickly explain the difference between and the transition between swamps, marsh, bogs, and fens? What are those different things and how are they different?
Sure. Bogs are rain fed. Fens are fed by underground streams. That's one of the big differences, primarily the big difference. And so marshes and they accumulate less peat. They still have peat, but they're not big manufacturer of peat. Uh, the advantages of marsh and swamps is that because they're not nearly as acidic, they tend to be much more conducive for nesting of waterfowl and other birds. So you have a lot of different trade-offs. A bog will tend to be very acidic, and produce only certain types of plants. And same goes for a fen. We have fens, in Western Canada that are still percolating water in minus 30, 35 degrees Celsius temperatures. And it's one of the reasons why some of these really fragile plants. There's one near Edmonton, Alberta, that's worth seeing. It's got quite the story behind it because the Lougheed government tried many years ago to drain that, but a group of botanists from the University of Alberta and local citizens group, such as yourself, Nature Vancouver, that really love this place, got together, and the government said, "Well, you make a case for it. You tell us what's there that's really worth preserving." So they hired a botanist, and he went out and he found, I think, 28 orchids, which was three-quarters of all the orchids in Western Canada could be found in this one tiny fen just outside of Edmonton. And the one that really sold it, and I can't remember its name, forgive me, it's late right now, but there's only been about 7 or 8 that have been found. And so this is really what sold the government. Okay, we won't drain it. We'll build the highway around the fen and an overpass farther away. What nobody told the government was that this orchid was basically a little matchstick orchid, was the most ordinary thing, and everybody said, "Thank God they didn't have to produce it because, the lady slipper will wow you." But this thing was just it was the it was not a very showy plant. But the really neat thing about this, and consider this is Alberta, is that if you do drive, you make the drive from Edmonton to Jasper sometime, you stop along the ways. On the overpass that the government built, some guy from the Department of Transportation uh, decided that he's going to honor this by imprinting in the overpass a orchid. And unless you look, most people would not even know it was there. But I think that's just so cool. It just shows you, how some people, most, unlikely people can be inspired by events.
Okay, well, I'll take the first of the questions in the chat is we have from Eliza, we have the potential of having a prime minister who understands the challenges of climate change. How do we get the message across that we have to stop extracting peat for horticultural uses? The UK has done it, plus a few other European countries. And also, if you could maybe elaborate on what are the biggest threats to peat? Is it horticultural, or is it, like you were saying, other kinds of development pressures?
Well, I have to say that, I think, Britain and the European countries were forced to act expeditiously because, they have drained so many peatlands and they're paying for it because of the tremendous amount of flooding, the landslides that are occurring, the fact that the water's not getting filtered. They've been at it for 300 years longer than we have. And we definitely have a fairly big peat extraction industry, but I have to give it to them. When I went to Quebec in the Gaspé region, which has the biggest extraction plants operations in the world, they've essentially decided that they're just going to maintain their footprint where it is, and they brought in scientists to grow peat. So they just basically move from one field, get the scientists to regrow the peat, then go to another, and they keep rotating. So they're not really expanding their operations, and they're hiring a lot of people. There's a town in Quebec that was essentially on its last legs, and it's been completely revived by the peat industry. And it's hard to, say shut it all down when I think, it's sustainable. In a perfect world where we say no. I think what we really have to focus on are places like northern Alberta where, all right, the oil sands has had its way for 50, 60 years, but they continue to drain peatlands. They're now proposing to drill underneath the McClellan Bog, which is one of the last peatlands in the oil sands area. And the government gave them approval. And I just don't think there's any reason for that. I think that they've got enough bitumen that they're sending south. I really do, my feeling is that we've got to stop the expansion because they're really killing it. The Hudson Bay lowlands are possibly, is a place that we can prevent this from happening. The problem is in, the conservative premier, Doug Ford, wants the mines to be in there. He wants those jobs. He wants to build roads. I think our best bet is the indigenous people who, in that part of the world, are getting together and saying no. And I can tell you that 90% of all the peatland regions that have been protected in the last 20 years have been protected by indigenous people who basically have said no to oil and gas. I talked about the Rampart wetlands, wet area on the Mackenzie along the Mackenzie River. They've just set that aside, even though it's got all kinds of oil and gas reserves in there. They basically said, this is our grocery store. This is where we go hunt for caribou, for moose and ducks, and it's going to be there forever. The oil is going to come and go if, in 10 or 20 years. So indigenous people are really making, they're leading the way, and it's really heartening to see it.
Okay, we have a couple of other questions. You were mentioning seeding the peatlands to restore them, and I guess one question is, what do peat seeds look like? Are we talking about the sphagnum spores of sphagnum moss? And someone else is saying, are there other plant species that are typically included?
Well, Sphagmin's the main one, and as I described you on earlier, it is kind of like the Game of Thrones, where all the bodies are spread out in that marsh. They just spread and they grow and they grow and they grow, and all they really need is water, a few other seeds from different plants. You're certainly going to have, but a lot of it, if it's in a peatland that's been disturbed or drained, are just going to blow in from adjoining areas. It's my old professor at Harvard, E.O. Wilson, did one of the great experiments where they fumigated. And as he said, you would never be able to do these mangroves off the coast of Florida. They literally went in there and killed everything. And then they waited a few years to see what would happen. And it was remarkable just how many plants and insects recolonize. It was just simply the wind blowing in seeds and the insects being blown back in. And so if you give nature a chance, it's pretty resilient. And I feel the same way about trees. I think we're spending a lot of effort on planting trees, where I think if we just gave them the chance, and you know this in Vancouver, there's a lot, they grow very, very fast, not just trees, but all kinds of other plants. And you've got the perfect conditions where you don't have to do plantations. Just let them do their thing and in areas that are set aside where they can do it. And I think that's really the key. We've just got to start letting Mother Nature do things on their own with a little help. And in these peatlands, remember, the reasons why they were destroyed, why they were harvested, was that basically we just pumped out all of the water. And many, in Abbotsford, I don't know how many pumps that they still have going to keep water out of those agricultural areas. And, in the city of Edmonton, for example, right next to the university in one of the subdivisions, for years and years and years, it was flooding. And it was a nightmare. And nobody put two and two together until someone realizes that it used to be a wetland. The city just drained it and built a whole bunch of houses on this wetland. And so when the rain did come, and it came hard, it just filled it up, and the homeowners couldn't do anything about it. So I think we've been at war with nature in so many ridiculous ways. We haven't really thought things through. We really think that we can outdo them, and we're seeing it right now with fire. Fires are burning bigger, hotter, and faster. It's a meteorological event that we cannot stop. People still think that if we put more water bombers in the air and more people on the ground, we're going to be able to stop it. That's not the case. it's going to be it's a climate change story. And I think that, we have to put wetlands back in there to be one of those natural barriers for fire, to slow fire, to even stop it in some cases.
Thank you very much. One additional question in the chat is there any science from Catherine Baldwin? Is there any science or landscape management technique that can be used to slow permafrost melt?
Yeah, boy, everybody's on that bandwagon, and the reality is that the best way is not to cut down trees. So, peatlands are located in our boreal forest, and when you expose, you those peatlands by cutting down so many trees, things heat up. The other thing is that again, going back to this draining of bogs, is that we do have the ability to um, bring back, what Mother Nature intended to do. And I think we just got to stop draining these peatlands, and they will maintain, that permafrost. But I'm afraid, to some extent, permafrost is, eh, the permafrost in the Arctic is not going to go away anytime soon, because, it's up to 800 feet thick in some places. And so it's going to take a lot of time. But the problem is that it's also going to produce a lot of water, and it's changing the landscape. You know, the Arctic, one of the biggest problems right now is runways and highways, are buckling because the peat beneath is disintegrating. Houses are tilting over. It's a huge engineering problem, and I think that I know that people are working on it, but it's happening. So things are warming up so fast that I'm not optimistic. I think that possibly the best thing we can do in places like the Hudson Bay lowland is let's just not build a whole bunch of mines and accelerate the thawing.
Okay, Dorothy Glover asks, could you show the slide of the diagram of a bog that was about halfway through? She said it went by so fast there wasn't really time to see it.
Layer, the anaerobic layer. So this is basically where you've got the oxygen and the microbes, are active and they promote the growth of tree. At a
Okay.
certain stage, you've got the area where basically there's no oxygen. So essentially, there's no microbes breaking anything down. And so that's why, for example, I'm actually writing another book on this, is why we find the great treasures trove of fossils in the Klondike gold fields, of hundreds of ice age animals that have been perfectly preserved because they are then in this anaerobic layer where they haven't been broken down. So you've got saber-toothed cats, if you recall maybe that baby mammoth that was found about 3-4 years ago in the Klondike. And also, you've got that permafrost that actually does the refrigeration. So you've got two things happening in the Arctic that you don't have happening farther south, is that you have continuous permafrost in the high Arctic along with this anaerobic layer. And it's a perfect refrigerator and keeps the microbes from being active. And it holds things for a very, very long period of time, but basically allows everything on top to hold. And so those plants have all adapted themselves to the acidity, to the fact that they're going to have to root themselves, in a shallow way because the permafrost is not going to let them go deep. And so you have just a wonderful assortment of plants that essentially have had to adapt over hundreds of thousands of years to a different type of ecosystem. And what's really interesting is that you also have, tremendous amount of things that you wouldn't expect in the Arctic peatlands, such as butterflies. I was just actually last summer up in the Klondikes, and I saw this enormous uh, uh, group of swallowtails, um, and that have never seen that far north. And so it's pretty cool. I think, we're just beginning to really appreciate what we have and what grows there and how unique these ecosystems are, and how really, in a sense, quintessentially Canadian because unlike the Russians and the rest of the world, our peatlands, generally speaking, are relatively intact.
Thank you very much.
We have another comment from Helen Gowans to remind people of Camosun Bog in Pacific Spirit Park, right on the edge of Vancouver, and that's a great place to go if you want to get an up close experience of bogs and the kind of restoration work that's being done there.
There's one that by Surrey too. I can't remember the name of it. It's quite a large bog. In fact, it's more of a marsh than it is a bog, but I think they call it a bog. And it's actually, I think, one of the I've been there. It's a terrific birding site.
That would that be Burns Bog?
No, not Burns Bog.
More in Surrey. Not sure. And Peter asks,
Oh,
oh,
Serpentine Bog.
oh, Serpentine Slough, or Serpentine Bog. Okay,
Yeah,
yeah.
yeah.
Peter
Great birding
asks,
spot.
are grizzly polar bear hybrids a viable species? I guess are they fertile? Which behaviors do they exhibit as grizzlies or polar
Well, we
bear?
have, unfortunately, we haven't seen enough in the wild because every time we see one, someone kills it. And and that's just the plain fact. They are, theoretically they could produce, and in fact, we know this is how evolution takes place. Whether they can, we just don't know. And really, the problem, the handful of ones that I think, there've been only one that I know of that has been spotted was not killed. The other ones was killed. The first one in 2006 was by an American hunter. Another one was by an Inuit man. And so and we're seeing this hybridization of a lot of different species in the Arctic. And unfortunately, we just don't have the scientists out there. We're not funding that kind of research anymore to the extent that we did in the past. So we don't really know what's going on, except for the fact, as you'll find out in my next book, is that we've got grizzly bears now migrating north. We have this unique population of orcas that have gone into the Arctic where they've never been seen before. And it turns out that they're an new ecotype that kills bowhead whales, narwhal, and beluga whales. So unlike the other orcas in that part of the world that basically feed on fish and seals, these guys are whale eaters. And they've found that they're coming all the way from Spain and going into the Arctic in places where, ice used to stop them from going. But it gets even cooler because when a geneticist came in to try to figure out the origins of these whales, to figure out, where do they fit in, to the big picture, it turns out they got their start during the Ice Age. So they may actually just be going home. And we just didn't know it, until, you know, a year ago when the Inuit found 11 dead bowhead whales, and scientists came in and realized that they were killed by orcas.
Mm.
So things really are, cougars now are in the Arctic, grizzly bears, um, you know, robins are on the Arctic islands. When I did a bird survey of Banks Island, we saw the first short-eared owls on the islands. Um, so animals are migrating north and very, very quickly, to some extent because it's not as cold. But I think the other problem is that down south, it's just not conducive as it once was to their survival.
Two more mentions of local bogs is Pitt Addington Marsh
Mhm.
in the Fraser Valley, and George mentions that there's also a peat bog in the U Lake Meadows in Cypress Provincial Park. Um, so if anybody else has the questions, you're able to unmute yourself and ask your question now. Is there any? If not, I have one other question, which was, I'm quite astonished by the idea of how it sounds like how how quickly and effectively the peat can be restored by seeding. I guess we get this thing about, centuries and, things that have been in the peat for millions of years, and then to kind of reconcile that with the fact that you were saying this commercial operation is actually kind of regrowing their peat sort of like you would kind of a farmer's field. Can you tell us how fast under average and ideal conditions does peat grow, and how compacted does it have to be kind of a bog, or is it?
Yeah, I'm guessing here, but it's not when I say relatively short, you're looking at say maybe 20, 25 years.
Oh yeah,
Uh
that's like short compared with
yeah,
5,000.
yeah. If you're going to grow a forest, it's probably going to take, three times that length of time. The drawback is that they're basically getting only 80% restoration of the plants and insects that used to grow. They're working on that. Um, it's not perfect, and but in areas outside where they're not extracting, but they're restoring peatlands that have been degraded, they're having a lot better luck simply because there's more time for those species to come back, and it really does not require a lot. It doesn't it just simply requires the water that was always wanting to be there, some seeds, a little bit of fertilizer, and at the very beginning, some hay, to prevent the sun from nuking whatever nutrients or plants will grow. And once it gets growing, and as anybody knows about sphagnum mosses, is that they really are resilient. They can go through a 20, 30, 40-year period of drought and you just add water and they come back.
Teresa, I have a question, if that's possible.
Sure.
So Edward, you had mentioned that permafrost can be as deep as about what, 800 feet or so?
In the Arctic, yeah.
In the Arctic. Okay, I'm wondering of all of the locations that you've mentioned all over the world. Some will be obviously they vary, but I wonder what the deepest peatland is that you are familiar with. Like how deep can they get?
I think over 800 feet for absolutely certainly.
Mm.
I'm not sure I'm giving you the most accurate information. I can look that up in my notes. But the Western Arctic, northern Yukon, Northwest Territories, Alaska, has tremendous reservoirs of peat. In fact, it's almost all peat, and it's all very, very deep there. The
Mm.
Hudson Bay lowlands, the peat is also extremely deep because it's just had, hundreds of centuries to be able to build up year after year. Remember, it's just decaying vegetation that it eventually gets deposited in, pushed down into that anaerobic layer and slowly decays, but then just becomes layer after layer after layer, and so it can build up. And if it's not disturbed, and you can have have the process continuing, it goes on for a long time, kind of like a tree ring.
Mm. So am I understanding then that you need that source of water to be continually flowing into these peatlands as well, so that the continuing deposition of sediments is occurring?
Yeah. And the water I'm not talking about is not transporting wet water from elsewhere. Is simply letting water that we have continued to drain out of those places to just settle back in.
Mm, mm,
Many of these places, like the McKernan subdivision in Edmonton and in Abbotsford, that areas that have been drained, they're active pumps, as we speak,
yes,
keeping the water out.
right,
And so, if you shut the pumps off, the water is going to come back because it's
right.
just gravity
Yeah, and rainfall, that kind of thing is actually helping to fill
and
that.
groundwater and
Yes,
groundwater,
groundwater.
if it thins.
Right. Good, thank you.
I've just put into the because this has been a lot to absorb, I've just put into the chat the names of a few of Edward's books. The Big Thaw, Travels in the Melting North, the North and West Passage, Dark Days at Noon, The Future of Fire, and the Swamplands, Tundra Beavers, Quaking Bogs, and the Improbable World of Peat, of which this talk was based. So I think people will be heading to the library to check out some of those books and learn more. Oh, and a final comment, Eliza mentions that she believes that one of the bogs in the Tibetan Mongolia area is estimated to be 50,000 years old.
Yep. She's right.
Well, thank you very much. That's been a very informative and wide-ranging talk, and will give us a lot more to think about and look into. And